So why don't we start by reading from St. Matthew's Gospel, from chapter 21, verse 33, and we'll read to the end of the chapter. Another parable. There was a householder who planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, and dug a wine press in it, and built a tower, and leased it to tenants, and went into another country. When the season of fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servants and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. He sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same to them. Afterward, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance." And they took him and cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what do the tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruit in their seasons." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the very stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation producing the fruits of it. And he who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, but when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. But when they tried to arrest him, they feared the multitudes, because they held him to be a prophet. So we had started to discuss this last week, so I'll sort of quickly summarize for Mary. So this parable is found in Mark in chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, as well as in Luke chapter 20, verses 1 to 19. The quotation here about the cornerstone comes from Psalm 118, verses 22 and 23, but Luke only quotes verse 23. Both Luke and Matthew allude to the stone, but not Mark. Luke has no explanation of the parable, nor does Mark, that corresponds to verse 21 in chapter 23. And Mark refers to the vineyard owner as a man than a householder. So we also talked about this parable as sort of following in the tradition of Nathan's parable in 2 Samuel, verses 12, chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, in which Samuel has murdered has murdered Uriah so that he can marry Bathsheba, or he's had him murdered. He hasn't actually committed the murder himself, but he's ordered him murdered. And Nathan presents a scenario or a parable which is intended to trap David into accusing himself about a wealthy man with many sheep who's killed a poor man's single sheep that he has raised really as a pet, so presumably raising the sheep for its wool, and has killed it and slaughtered it to feed it to his guests when he has plenty of sheep. And so Nathan asks what should be done to him, and David is indignant, and then finally Nathan says, "You're the man." And David confesses and repents of his murder as well as his lustfulness. So this is a parable in denial, as is the previous parable, where the idea is that the Pharisees will condemn themselves and trap themselves, as they indeed do. So it draws on two traditional elements. And we've seen throughout the Bible study that Jesus often draws on very traditional elements from the Old Testament, very traditional elements from rabbinic interpretation, very traditional elements from the Talmud. Yet, despite drawing on traditional elements, he always transforms them in a very radical way. So the novelty here is that there are two traditional themes. There's the rejection and the murder of the prophets, which he's drawing on, and also the metaphor of Israel as God, which is a major metaphor in the Old Testament. He's transforming them by joining them in the service of Christology with his reference to the cornerstone. So we talked about the parable as the parable allegory and the imagery in the parable. So the parable is a symbolic account of the history of Israel. The leadership rejected God's earlier prophetic message and messengers. And so the leadership is now on the point of killing God's own son. And so the parable is drawn from its opening echoes the vineyard allegory in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. So let's take a look at that again. We read it last week, but it's very important since it almost certainly serves as the basis of Jesus' parable. The opening is really identical. And so
where is it we're going?
it's Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. Let me sing for my beloved a love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I beg you, between me and my vineyard, that I have not, I bungled that. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled. It shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, a cry. So it's a parable of judgment and of destruction. So instead of that, this is not a parable of destruction. It is a parable of judgment. It's a parable of judgment and of replacement. So the vineyard, obviously, as it says in Isaiah, represents Israel or Jerusalem. So God makes all of the preparations to make it a fruitful vineyard, both in Isaiah's parable as well as in Jesus' parable. He builds the fence, digs trenches, plants the vineyard, builds a watchtower, and digs a wine press. And in Isaiah, he asks, "What more was there to do for my vineyard?" And then in Isaiah, to remove any doubt about the allegory, Isaiah writes that the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. So here in Jesus' parable, the ending is new. Whereas in Isaiah, the vineyard is destroyed. And so in the patristic tradition, the destruction of the vineyard in Isaiah is interpreted as a prophecy about the temple's destruction. Here, the vineyard remains and it's entrusted to others. And so it's going to be tenants who are destroyed as the scribes and chief priests themselves pronounce judgment on themselves. So it's the tenant farmers, which is to say the religious leaders, and not the vineyard replaced. And Matthew uses the word ethnos as the people to whom the vineyard is given. And so ethnos is not necessarily Gentiles, but a group of people. And we'll talk about that in a bit later. So whereas in Isaiah, the parable is a very bleak one. There's simply destruction and no care for the vineyard. Here, there's hope, although it remains a bleak a bleak parable because it amounts to condemnation of existing tenants of the vineyard, who are the religious establishment. So the householder, Matthew uses the same phrase here as in the earlier parable in chapter, the laborers in the vineyard, except that in verse 21, chapter 21, verse 40, he refers to the householder as Kyrios, or Lord. The landowner is an image of God. So he has an exclusive claim to the vineyard and all its fruit. In verse 27, he says, "They will respect my son." So why does this prove that God is not omniscient?
Verse 27?
No, he's got the wrong number.
37.
37. Yeah.
They will respect my son.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah. What was the question? Sorry.
Doesn't this disprove God's omniscience?
No, because man still has free will.
Uh-huh. Exactly. That's St. Jerome's argument. God knows the outcome, but is said to be uncertain to preserve human free will. And St. Ignatius of Antioch argues in his letter to the Ephesians when he talks about the parable that everyone whom the master of the house sends to do his business ought to be received as if he was the master. So that's the tradition behind sending your servants or your son, that they're acting in the person of the master. So you would expect that certainly the son would be, treated properly.
Oh, for sure.
And there is an element of free will, that one can always recognize that what one is doing and repent one's sins. And there's always a hope that one will, but of course, often there is no repentance, and there's even no recognition that one has sinned. God puts up with completely unacceptable behavior for far longer than a real householder. The real one would have done something after the killing of the first servant. Right? So God is incomprehensibly kind to his enemies who don't deserve. He knows that the tenants hate him. The owner continues to appeal to the tenant's sense of honor. So the owner appears to be a fool. He, in an honor and a culture based on honor and shame, he's not playing by the rules at all. So it's very much like the father in the parable of the lost son, right? Or the prodigal son. The prodigal son has insulted the father, treated him as if he were dead by asking for his share of the inheritance in advance, which is a statement that his father is dead to him. The father has given him his inheritance, and then when the son has squandered, the father runs out to greet him. He should his son should be dead to him. His son has really, dealt a mortal insult,
But
completely shamed him.
he came repenting, right? He came repenting.
Yeah, he came repenting. That's true. But nevertheless, in an honor and shame culture, that makes the father into a fool. The point of the parable is that the father is an image of God, and both the prodigal son and the other son are images of us. The major difference between the two of them, I mean, they were both concerned with what they were getting. The major difference between them is that the older son had the virtue of patience, and the younger son had the virtue of honesty. But they didn't have both virtues. So, in some sense, they were both, both fell shamefully short of goodness or virtue or integrity. So the owner of the vineyard puts up with unacceptable behavior for far longer, but at the same time, it can only last so long. And it's going to end. So the owner of the vineyard in verse 40 finally comes, but that really needs no particularly allegorical interpretation. So some have referred to it as the parousia of the second coming of Christ, but that's not really the very consistent with the parable. It's not a parable of the second coming, though it is a parable of judgment. So we find the fulfillment of the parable or the fulfillment of judgment in who knows where we find it.
Parable of the judgment.
Where do we find the fulfillment? It's a prophetic parable of judgment. So when and where do we find the fulfillment of the parable?
Hmm.
43. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God taken away from you and given to you.
Mm-hmm.
No, not in
Not in the
Oh.
same one.
not in the parable.
Oh.
Our lives.
In history,
And
where do we find?
Well, when the destruction of the temple.
Right, we find it in 70 when
okay.
the temple is destroyed, basically in the generation after the death of Christ.
Oh.
So the tenant farmers then, who are they?
The Pharisees.
In this case, the chief priests and elders,
Okay.
since it's the chief priests and elders who come to challenge Jesus' authority
Mm-hmm.
and ask him by what authority he does this, then try to trap him. Asking him by what authority is the trap. Then they ask him, let me go back to Matthew. They ask him by what authority. Jesus refuses to answer.
Oh, there it is, 45.
And then asks them by what, Jesus asks them whether John the Baptist was from, whether his baptism was from heaven or from man. And they refuse to answer because Jesus has in turn set a trap for them. And so Jesus similarly refused to answer. But he doesn't say he doesn't know. He says he simply won't tell them. So whereas they're liars, they do know, or they do have an answer that they believe to be true. They're trying to hedge the question and save themselves. And then
The
come the
funny thing
two.
is, and the funny thing is, Jesus knows exactly what they're thinking.
Yeah, yeah. So
And he becomes the cornerstone of the church.
right. So harvest time is an eschatological time. The word is kairos, it's the harvest. And obviously, what you do at the harvest is you harvest the fruit, right? So harvest time demands that the fruit be evident. And so the sending of the Son also has, so that's eschatological. The sending of the Son also has an eschatological dimension. So in the allegory, the fruit represents what is owed to God. And there's a difference between Mark and Matthew. In Mark, the owner gets his share. In Matthew, all of the fruit belongs to the owner. So there's a theological symbolism here that God demands the totality of our lives. He doesn't demand 10% of our lives, as in the tithe. He doesn't demand some of our attention. He demands the totality of our lives. And so throughout Matthew's gospel, fruit represents the life that God requires of his people and the works that result from their faith. So, for example, John talks about bearing fruit that befits repentance. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about ravenous wolves in sheep's clothing that are known by their fruit. In chapter 12, verse 33, he says that a tree is known by its fruit. And chapter 13 has the parable of the sower who is sowing lavishly and recklessly everywhere, and only some things, some areas bear fruit. And chapter 13, verse 20, there's a parable of the wheat and the tares, and the eschatological harvest and the separation of the wheat and the tares in chapter 13.
So the harvests are all eschatological, you're saying?
Right.
Mentions of harvest. Okay.
A harvest is a time for an assessment of the quality and amount of the fruit, time for a gathering together of the fruit. And so you gather it and you see whether there is any and whether it's good fruit. In the case of Isaiah's vineyard, the fruit is wild grapes. So God planted grapes, which are used for wine. And so, they're cultivated. You have to care for grapes to have wine, or you have no wine. Wild grapes are presumably not good for wine. They're wild grapes. They're uncultivated. They're just grapes. They may even be, edible, but who wants to eat grapes when the point is that, you have to make them to have wine. Wine is very important because it's a durable beverage. It will last for years, as opposed to most beverages other than water have a very, very short life. Wine is critically important in many was critically important in many cultures. Without wine, your only reliable beverage is water, and water is a very can be a very difficult commodity to get. We assume that we turn on our tap and outflows the water, but water is a scarce commodity in much of the world. So wine can be much more abundant. So the repeated sending of the servants corresponds to the servants are represent or are symbols of the prophets. And Jeremiah, Amos, and Zechariah all call the prophets servants of God.
And they did get killed in many cases, didn't they?
Right, and they did get killed in many cases. According to tradition, Jeremiah was stoned. You remember he also was dropped into the bottom of the well, right, and sort of left there to die until the king's servant pulled him out because he didn't feel it was right to kill Jeremiah. The death of the prophets is recorded in Jeremiah as well as in Second Chronicles. So the parable is so important. Jesus, Brother Matthew uses the same word for killed for the deaths of the prophets. In chapter 23, he uses it for the death of John in chapter 14. And in the missionary discourse, he uses it for the death of the disciples and the deaths of Christians through martyrdom in chapter 10 and 24. And then he uses it for the death of Jesus himself in Jesus' foretellings of his death in chapter 16, chapter 17, and then in the Passion in chapter 6. So the sending of prophets, killing especially, points to a continuity in salvation history, right? That Jesus' death is a part of, continuous with, the long line of deaths that mark salvation history. The death of the prophets, the death of the last great prophet, John, and the death of Jesus himself. So it points to both continuity and obviously a discontinuity were being killed. It's now the Son, and of course the Son is a representative and has the authority of the Father. So therefore, it's an attempt to kill God the Father as well. So that introduces a huge discontinuity in salvation history. So stoning is mentioned in in verse 35. And stoning is significant. So first of all, stoning is a communal mode of execution, right? So you can't blame an individual for stoning somebody. You have to blame a group. But here the being charged is the religious establishment. So it's a parable of condemnation of religious establishment. The also there's a continuity here between Jesus and the prophets, because after stoning, a person guilty of a crime punishable by death has to be hung up after execution. That's from Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 22 and 3. I don't have to go there, I'll just quickly read it. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is accursed by God, and you shall not defile your land which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance. So after execution, hanging up on a tree and then taking down before sunset.
That was Deuteronomy 1, 2, 2 and 3?
Deuteronomy 21.
Oh, 21. Okay.
Chapter 21, verses 22 and 23.
Okay.
Well, that's what they did to Christ.
Yeah.
Right. That's why Paul says that hanging on a tree is accursed. Accursed is one who hangs on a tree. The Son is clearly a symbol for Jesus. And when the landowner says they will respect my son, the Greek word used corresponds to the Latin word latria. Does anyone know what latria is?
Honoring. Is that worshiping God?
It's the worship that's due God.
Due to God. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there are three words. There's latria, which is the worship due exclusively to God. There's hyperdulia, which is the worship due to Mary as
Mhm.
the bearer of God.
Mhm.
And there's Dulia, the worship due to the saints.
Mhm.
So cross the line between Dulia and hyperdulia versus latria. When you cross that boundary, you commit idolatry.
Mhm.
And idolatry is the most serious sin you can commit against God, which is to say, it's the most serious sin you can commit.
Is Latria Greek then?
It's Latin.
Latin.
So rejecting the Son is the culminating act of rebellion. The Son is to latria, and he's killed. So it's an act of defiance that the Father cannot possibly overlook.
Mhm.
And so the parable also corresponds to the details of Jesus' passion. So the act of defiance cannot be overlooked by the Father because he's killed the Son, who is a personification of the Father, right? As the authority of the Father, bears the very stamp of his authority, as Hebrews says. And so the details of the death of the Son in Matthew roughly correspond to the details of Jesus' passion. And unlike Mark, Matthew even has the Son thrown outside the vineyard before he's killed, which is a representation of crucifixion on Golgotha outside of the city boundaries. And so, and then the new tenants that the scribes and chief priests talk about represents the church. So then, after presenting the parable, Jesus asks, "What will he do to the tenants?" And he's asking them to pronounce judgment on themselves, which they do. So they're giving an answer that will be turned against them.
Mm-hmm.
Their response about giving him the produce at harvest time is also symbolic. In says, "And lease the vineyards to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons, or give him the produce at harvest time," which is a reference to Psalm 1, verses 1 through 3, which contrast with 4:6. "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers." So it's like the vineyard, the tenants presenting the harvest of the vineyard to the Lord as they, or to its owner as they are expected to in the parable. "The wicked are not so, but are like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked will perish. So don't produce fruit. Instead, they're like chaff which the wind blows away. So whatever harvest there is gets scattered by the wind. They're unfruitful and they will perish. So then we have the issue of the cornerstone.
Mhm.
So how does the cornerstone fit in to this? Does anyone have any idea?
Well, the stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So,
Uh-huh.
and it was Christ that was rejected.
Uh-huh.
Killed.
Right.
So I think that's how it all connects.
Mm-hmm. And in the parable, it's the son who's killed and
Yeah.
rejected.
Right, right.
So the parable is a parable of judgment,
Mhm.
but taken itself, it's ambiguous. So the owner of the vineyard comes and kills its tenants and replaces them. So that's merely a replacement of tenants, right? It's sort of no big deal.
Well, the new tenants will give him the fruits in their season.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So
Right. And the new tenants are, the word used in Greek is ethnos, but it's unclear what ethnos means within the context of the parable. And so the cornerstone begins to provide the meaning of what ethnos is, who those new tenants are, because somehow they're related to the cornerstone, who is Jesus.
so the new ones are the Christians?
The new ones are the disciples of Christ.
Hmm.
So it's the people of the vindicated and resurrected Son of God who become the cornerstone. So initially, they're not Christians.
Initially, they were Jews, right?
Initially, they're Jews who are followers of Christ, and then they come referred to the way, and eventually in Antioch, the term Christian is first used to describe them. And obviously, there's over time, the inclusion of the Gentiles, but initially, they are Jews, basically Jews only, with no doubt a few exceptions, but Jews. So next week
Wrap up.
we'll start over with the cornerstone for just kind of continuity for the recording, and we'll also start chapter 22 and hopefully do the first parable, which is a good one. So the issue is, so in some sense, the parable is kind of clear as an allegory, but so there's a so the king orders in all of these people from the street, right? Just all of the random people who are willing to come, who he finds. And then he casts out one for not being appropriately dressed.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
So how can he do that? I mean, what outrageous thing to do is this? When these are poor people who don't have formal attire to attend the banquet. So is that fair? Because obviously the king is a representative of God. So is the king a despot? That's the question to be answered. One of the questions to be answered in the parable.
You want to turn off
A hint, the king is not a despot.
Yeah.
So We'll turn off the recording.